I often wonder how necessary our thoughts about productivity, efficiency, and discipline are when it comes to making art. With the overwhelming abundance of improvement-focused content online, it's easy to go through the practice day to day, functioning under the belief that art is something to be conquered or figured out, or that art is a skill first and an expressive craft second. I'm of the persuasion that your personal art practice shouldn't require rigor or willpower, and that this sort of energy is probably best reserved for elsewhere in life. I find that these mind states are unnecessary in art because, more often than not, they tend to be adopted as attempts to correct what's likely not really the problem we may be facing with our art. All assumptions you make about what conditions need to be met for you to start enjoying your work, or how disciplined or focused you have to be to improve and reach your goals, stem from a place of discomfort and uncertainty with the art. Aside from time itself, much of what stands between where we are now and where we dream of being with our art are barriers that we erect ourselves, and barriers that we fortify each time we don't take a moment to question or challenge our core assumptions. If you've only ever operated under the belief that making or improving at art requires a sort of stern, militant discipline, motivation, or aimless willpower, you only further shape the kind of practice where these conditions become necessary for you to make art regularly. You build a deep association between these thoughts and your art, and you're also setting limitations on yourself by going about things this way, since subscribing to such beliefs reduces the amount of freedom to be experienced with your art, and it gives way to the common permission-seeking tendency amongst artists as well. Discipline is not necessary in art, and concepts like efficiency and productivity are fundamentally inapplicable to art. They can only apply to things we've made adjacent to the art, such as career or business concerns, or academics. If making and learning art could be optimized or made efficient in any broad sense, that would imply both objectivity in art and the existence of suboptimal or inefficient practices in art. Considering there's almost nothing in art that is universally agreed upon as being correct, but there is just about every sworn by and conflicting art opinion out there that you could imagine, it becomes clear that there is little to say about art and how one should approach it that is logical, provable, or definitive. You would have to get everyone on the same page of what art even is to begin with, before it would make sense to apply ideas about discipline, best practices, or what's right or wrong to it. And we can't quite seem to agree on what it is across the board. I also believe that it can be, at the very least, unhelpful and, at the most, damaging to view creativity through the lens of productivity. It seems that nowadays, too many artists are a bit too concerned, I think, about how much or how little they've drawn, if they've done any drawing at all, or how many hours of work they're able to log or put on the clock on any given day. Since for most of us, our views on whether we've been productive or not are colored with certain moods and associations, when we tangle an airy yet emotionally weighted concept like being productive up with our personal practice, we almost invariably create conditions in our art that can only be fulfilled if our standards of productivity are met, which is, of course, a shaky foundation to build a practice upon. And expecting to meet such conditions assumes that you have control over external factors in your life or your always fluctuating day-to-day level of drive and energy. Speaking from my own experience of a viewpoint I find to be more helpful, if I manage to get a good session of creativity in, when I think back on my day overall, I don't view the time I chose to spend on my art as productive. Now, that might seem to imply that I instead view it as unproductive, but that doesn't apply here either. The fact of the matter is that there are numerous other ways to make evaluations on the way we spend our time aside from just productivity, such as how meaningful or fulfilling an activity was to you, or how you felt in the moment of doing it, regardless of whether or not the act was done towards some external end goal. And it's from this point of view that I evaluate the time I spend making art and how it contributed to my day. And I should add that, assuming my use of time hasn't been terribly disjointed or irresponsible on that day, These evaluations I make are never serious, and as best as I can, I don't allow them to suggest anything about me. They're just passing thoughts. Perhaps framing our efforts as being productive or not would make more sense if directed towards other duties in life that we generally don't do for their own sake, but rather because we have to, such as paying bills, doing chores, preparing for exams, or tending to work or business matters. These are things that have externally contingent end goals. But when it comes to your art, since it's something that is worth doing for its own sake, there's no need to treat it the same way we do these other tasks. It's worthwhile to begin the process of detaching concepts like discipline and productivity from your relationship with art as soon as possible. And removing them doesn't necessarily mean that you'll make less progress in your art or that there shouldn't be hard work involved. Although I do think plenty of artists could benefit from less hard work, but more on that later. Concerns that place exaggerated importance on progression and effort put into art are some of the most common, yet subtle and corrosive limiting beliefs held amongst developing artists. These beliefs, at least the way I see them, are the fault of the part of the brain that's always trying to make sense of everything and longs for sound logic, correctness, and validation. It seeks to instill predictability in art. It has us telling ourselves, if I put X amount of effort for Y amount of time, I'll achieve exactly the results I want. When we let this run unchecked, as we often do, it becomes the sole arbiter of decisions we make in the realm of art, a place where its greatest natural ability is messing things up and making art miserable and unsustainable. But more broadly speaking, I don't believe this desire for rationale or sense of correctness needs to be completely eradicated from the practice either. There is still a framing where logical and conceptual approaches can have their place in art. But I think this is best adopted when they're in service of free expression at the core, and only after much scrutiny has been given towards their role in your art to begin with. If the urge to center your practice around validation and truth still seems insurmountable, you can, in fact, forge your own mental model of correctness, detached from any externally conditioned notions of what's right, and operate under that instead. Such a model could then satisfy the part of the brain that feels it needs to cling to something practical, and it could also serve your art rather than handicapping you. With regard to reaching your goals, in reality, it's of course undeniable that getting where you want to be with your art does take some manner of hard work, but the part people seem to miss is that you don't need to approach this whole endeavor as if it's hard work. And the reason is that I think the modern notion of hard work is already a loaded term encumbered with a sort of grind set baggage that seems to demand constant discipline, even if it's against your better judgment at times. And unfortunately, too many people really don't evaluate things like what an increase of focused effort towards their art would mean or look like to them, or whether or not it's even necessary for their goals. When these sorts of things remain unquestioned, you'll most likely just default to the lowest common denominator definition of work ethic, a definition I find aimless and impractical for the artist on its own. I find that a much better alternative to this is to instead prioritize conserving your energy in the long run by managing how much and in what ways you're exerting yourself each day so that you can regularly return to art for the tens of thousands of hours art takes, rather than burning yourself out and brewing all sorts of resentment while you're at it. I think persistence on being disciplined about art also calls into question how we view the role of discipline in other areas of our life outside of art. If you like art and you want to improve at it, but it's still difficult to believe that there's no need to approach your art in a purely structured or disciplined manner, ask yourself, is such structure and discipline needed for any of the other things you casually enjoy? You're probably not relying on discipline, motivation, or sheer grit to listen to music or play video games or consume content you enjoy. I'd say you typically just do these things because you feel like doing them in the moment. There's no complex guilt process or act of will that's needed for you to start these things. And for the most part, it's generally easeful to get into them. And conversely, even if you may want to do these things, you likely don't find yourself in a rut or questioning your self-worth if on any given day you happen to feel unmotivated to do any one of them. Instead, you simply don't do it if you're not feeling up to it that day. This is perfectly normal. But then, why do we treat art differently? Some might think it's because, compared to these other interests, they probably just don't love art enough, or at least not as much as so-and-so great artist that seems to be having a better time with their art than you are, and perhaps the barrier between you and enjoying art is skill. Of course, that's not the solution to this particular problem, but I don't really think that your love for art is the issue either. From the way I see it, when it comes to involving discipline, one of the biggest reasons why people tend to approach art differently than they do their other hobbies and interests is because it's the case for many people that it's not enough to just make art and be satisfied with that alone. Plenty of artists actually want to do something with their art, and for most, it then becomes necessary to develop skill in some way in order to do what they want with their art. And this is generally true. But the problem arises when these two acts, becoming skilled and doing what you want with your art, are viewed as steps to be approached sequentially, rather than distinct processes that are ran concurrently throughout the whole journey, which causes artists to hold off or delay making any attempts towards their creative aspirations until they've attained the skills they think are necessary to do so. And this line of thinking falls apart even more in actuality, because determining when and at what point one has finally attained such a vague and incalculable concept as skill, especially in art, is impossible. Once you couple that with the fact that a lot of artists, despite wanting to do something with their art, are still figuring out what exactly they want to achieve in art, and it becomes quite clear how one can latch on to sequential, skill-oriented practice or find themselves stuck viewing preparatory work as one of the only seemingly tangible measures of progression in their art. To those who have fallen victim to this trap, for as long as is necessary, push back against the idea that making art should be in some way a means to an external end. Reevaluate what each of your goals in art are really in service of, and investigate whether or not the pursuit of them might actually be contributing to your feelings of misalignment or artistic suffering. Consider even going as far as removing them entirely in favor of a goalless art practice where focus arises naturally and where the only compass you have to navigate it is your interest in what you discover along the way. All other skill, business, or career aspirations that we choose to let coincide with our art can only be pursued sustainably if the core of our practice is healthy. Once you've honestly evaluated the true reasons behind your efforts and motivations, such as answering questions like why you're on the path of art to begin with, and in what ways do you want art to contribute to your life, decisions to master certain skills, incorporate structure, or to strive towards obtaining a specific job will then be made from a place of intentionality and knowing yourself, and not locking yourself into these goals if future self-evaluations reveal newfound interests or suggest a change of plans. Even though discipline is unnecessary in navigating the art practice, there are certainly attitudes and mind states that are necessary for you to be equipped with if you wish to meaningfully partake in the lifelong vocation of being an artist without unneeded suffering. In lieu of developing discipline towards art, try to develop your peace with it instead. Channel your energy in each session not towards working more effortfully, but towards working slower and more thoughtfully. You can allow your art to be transformed into a space of peace by making peace and comfort with yourself and with your art habitual. Just as you do with other things you really care about, take your art and its role in your life seriously, but not at the expense of peace or fulfillment in it. Being serious about your art doesn't need to look serious or arise from strict discipline, nor does it need to match anyone else's image of what a serious art practice is. But also, at the same time, remember to carry yourself lightly. To be both serious and calm about your art isn't contradictory. These two mind states don't necessarily have to be at odds with each other. In making peace and comfort habitual in your art, You're opting for the more sustainable practice in the long run, as opposed to letting the internal pressure to grind at art, along with your shame for occasionally not drawing, fuel your journey down the road towards burnout. Make regular today the decisions and habits that will keep you joyfully engaged with art for years and decades to come. Thanks for listening.